So here we are in gloriously sunny Richmond Park here in West London, and we have two brand new lenses from Sony to test. The first one is a Sony FE 16mm f1.8G, and I'm sure you've noticed here we have the Sony FE 400-800mm f6.3-8 G OSS. So you're probably thinking, I'm going to have my work cut out using both of these lenses at either end of the spectrum and see how they work. But I'm pretty sure we can manage it. Let's go find out. Now for the moment, we're going to focus on the 400-800 simply because the deer are most active in the morning here in Richmond Park. So it makes more sense to actually use the long lens. So if you are interested in the 16mm f1.8, just scroll along to that part in the video. Let's talk a little bit about my test rig here. So first things first, we have a fantastic camera mated to this brand new lens. We have the Sony A9 III, and I couldn't really think of a better camera to mate this brand new lens to. 120 frames a second, it's absolutely fantastic and a real dream to use. And obviously we have a monopod here, mated to a Gitzo head, which is pretty much standard for this kind of shooting and this type of rig as well. I actually find that using a monopod is actually a lot easier than using a tripod. It gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of movement, but mated to this lens, which has OSS, and especially when it's set to setting 1 or mode 1, as it's called here, it actually really helps with those micro vibrations. So when you're shooting at 800mm, which I've already done a few times here with the deer behind me, and it's actually fantastic at reducing anything too distracting within your viewfinder. So let's talk a little bit about the construction of this lens. So the first thing to say, to me at least, it feels light. Obviously at the moment we're aided by the monopod, but even when I was carrying it around earlier, it actually felt surprisingly light, considering that this is actually a 400-800mm lens. So by comparison, the 600mm, which sits roughly in the mid-range of this, so I'm talking about the 600mm f4, that one weighs about 3 kilograms. This 400-800 weighs 2.4 kilograms. That's a whole 600 grams lighter than that lens. The other thing to mention is that this zoom range tops out at 800mm. That also makes this the longest zoom and the longest focal range lens that Sony make. So whilst we're talking about zoom ranges, we can talk about one of my favorite aspects of this lens, which is the zoom ring. It has an incredibly short throw between 400 and 800. But don't let that put you off. By incredibly, I don't mean that it's actually too short. I actually had to play with it before I began shooting, and I actually felt like the throw between 400 and 800 was actually perfect. And it makes the whole shooting experience really quick. When it's combined with the A9 III with its super fast shooting capabilities, it makes the whole experience really quick. So when you frame at 400mm and you want to reframe and get a bit closer at 800mm, everything just happens so quickly. And it is beautifully damped as well, so the whole shooting experience is actually really pleasurable. So another really helpful thing about the construction of this lens is the fact that it zooms internally, which is great when you don't want it to affect the balance of your rig and your setup. That can be really handy if you're ever shooting handheld, or if you're really pushing your exposures and you don't actually want to change the balance of your setup. So just to finish off on the construction of the lens, you'll be pleased to know that it is weather sealed. So there's rubber gaskets obviously where the lens meets the camera here on the lens mount, but also all the switches and all the buttons are all rubber gasketed. So you're safe in the knowledge that if you are caught in a downpour, you'll be safe and your switches just won't seize up. So lastly, we have the switches on the side of the lens. So at the top, we have the AF to MF manual focus toggle switch. Then we have the full-time DMF or direct manual focus, which is actually a really handy trait. So for example, if you're trying to shoot, let's say, an animal, but it's kind of behind some reeds and the camera might, for example, focus on the reeds, it's actually really handy to use that to kind of refocus manually and then re-engage autofocus. And this allows you to do that together with the menu settings in the back as to how you make that work. Then we have the focus range. So you have obviously full, so that'll be all the way from minimum focus all the way to infinity. And then you have 8 meters to infinity as well. So in case you actually want to stop the lens kind of like working too hard, for example, you can actually set it to 8 meters and infinity if your subject is actually quite far away. Then we have OSS, which is obviously the optical steady shot within the lens, and that can be toggled on and off. And lastly, we have the OSS modes, which are 1, 2, and 3. 1 is probably the most popular one, which is what minimizes like your micro shake in your hands. Then you have 2, which is when you're doing panning shots. And then you have number 3, which is traditionally used if the subject that you're focusing on is making dynamic movements. So that will help you compensate for that. So who is a Sony 400 to 800mm really for? So first, let's address the elephant in the room. So Sony have actually incorporated reduced focus breathing on this lens. Now, focus breathing is something that affects videographers and filmmakers. So whenever you're racking focus once you're filming, sometimes it could seem like actually the frame is creeping in and out a little bit. So it feels like you're basically zooming in. So as that's a trait that really only affects filmmaking, it's quite clear that Sony do have an eye on that really niche videography market. So think of filmmakers specializing in wildlife. So we covered the video side of things, so now we can move on to the still side of things. So who is this lens for when it comes to stills? Well, I think Sony have done a great job with this lens. Obviously we already have the 200 to 600 and we have the 600mm prime as well. And this one just gives you a little bit more reach and tons more flexibility. I mean, today I've been using the lens from 400 all the way up to 800. I'm not sure yet as to how many of my shots were 800mm, but I certainly have used it. I felt the zoom ring kind of top out all the way to the top end of the zoom range. So I am using it. And I think that's fantastic, especially when you're dealing with subjects and wildlife that you don't really want to disturb that much. Today, the deer, you can see them kind of looking up when you're getting close. So it was actually really nice to step back a bit and just not disturb the wildlife. You know, they're wild for a reason, and I quite like that. And I think this lens is really helping with that. So wildlife photographers, sports photographers, I think will take a lot of joy in this lens. It is lightweight for the size. It is compact. It has great features, and more importantly, it has the latest in Sony's construction. One of which is obviously the autofocus motor, which actually is linear rather than round, which means that it's actually much more efficient and quiet as well, which can be a great boon for wildlife photography. So now we're going to go from one end of the spectrum, this spectrum, to this spectrum. So we're going from 400 to 800mm all the way to 16mm. So we've gone from 400 to 800mm, where everything today felt like it was right there in front of me, to now feeling like it doesn't really matter how close I get to a subject. I feel like I've got acres of space all the way around, which is amazing and also quite disarming, but I'm also quite excited about the challenge. So let's just quickly reintroduce this lens again. This is a Sony FE 16mm f1.8 G. And the G is basically the G premium lens, which means it's not quite a G Master, but it is still manufactured to very exacting standards. So the other thing that's really cool about this lens is the f1.8 aperture, which is incredible for a 16mm lens. I still can't quite get over that really. Like, I'm quite old school, I think, and for me, super wide lenses really top out at about f2.8, f4. So having f1.8 at 16mm, it just kind of blows my mind a little bit, and especially as this lens is so incredibly light. I think this one weighs 304 grams, which makes it incredibly, incredibly light. So shooting at f1.8 at 16mm means that you can do really creative things with depth of field and give your images a really unique look. Not a lot of people have a super wide lens like this at this aperture, so it means that your images will probably stand out quite a lot. Which brings me to the next point, which actually is its minimum focus distance, which is actually 0.15 meters, so basically 15 centimeters, which is incredibly close. So it means that whenever you shoot, you can actually get depth of field with a lens as wide as 16mm. It's incredible. So one of the other great things about the 16mm is the fact that it's great for video. It's so good, in fact, that me and George, our cameraman, have actually swapped lenses. I've got his 35-1.4, and he's actually now on the 16mm. Now, what's amazing about this lens, aside from the width, making it very easy to make things look pretty cool, is the fact that it's very lightweight. So we've covered the weight already. It's about 304 grams. But also, in terms of how it focuses as well, it focuses internally, which means that the balance is never affected as you actually rack focus as well. So really handy for gimbal work, as we're showing you now. So the other thing that makes this lens really good for video is the actual autofocus motors. So on most lenses, autofocus motors tend to be rounded, I think. On the 16mm, they're actually linear, and that makes focusing really snappy, but also silent, which is fantastic. So for example, if you're doing a tracking shot fully open at f1.8, really close, you can be sure that the lens is actually going to track that motion. I mean, it's worked fantastically. We're on A9 III, which has the most unforgiving AF of pretty much any camera, so it'll be absolutely fine for video. So as proof of concept for the AF and the focus breathing, I'm actually going to approach the lens as close as I can get to see how well it actually tracks me, but also how good the focus breathing actually is. And just so you know, we're actually shooting at f1.8 right now. So I've got the 16mm back on my camera now. I think George liked it a little bit too much, so a bit of a battle there trying to get it back. But just to kind of wrap up kind of the construction of the lens, the rest of it is pretty standard Sony stuff really. So it's got an AF/MF switch here, and it's got your iris lock as well. And you can also declick or click the aperture. So obviously if you're a filmmaker, you can have the click off, which makes it completely smooth. You can have the click on if you prefer more of a stepped aperture, so you kind of know exactly where it is that you're landing if you can count it in your head. One quick thing about the construction of this lens, obviously it being a 16mm lens is a fantastic lens for astrophotography, but obviously its f1.8 aperture means that you can keep those exposure times down. For example, for a star traily sky, if you don't want the star trails and you want them kind of sharp, this lens will do a great job of reducing chromatic aberrations. The lens has 3 aspherical elements and 2 advanced aspherical elements. So in terms of construction, it's actually closer to the 14mm G Master than it is to the 20mm G. So who would benefit from owning the Sony FE 16mm f1.8 G? Well, from a photography point of view, Astro is the most obvious one, I would say. So the f1.8 aperture will do a great job of helping you minimize those exposure times. Equally, the construction of the lens is actually helping in reducing those chromatic aberrations if you are shooting fully open as well. Obviously, landscape photographers who want a bit more space in their images, and obviously people that want to focus on interiors as well, who actually want to have a decent wide-angle lens in their kit bag. From a video point of view, it is incredible. That internal focusing that doesn't really change the balance is great for gimbal work, for example, but also the fact that it has a declicked aperture and that lack of focus breathing make it amazing for video as well. So overall, a fantastic lens for both photo and for video for people that do want a bit more width in their images. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.